Let's move on now, Brendan, and let's move on to Rand Paul. National story that broke over the weekend. I thought it was over. And again, my personal opinion, it might be different than yours. You were there. I was not. I saw the video. You were there. And it appeared to me that, you had a bunch of, I don't know, a dozen, maybe 20 or 30 idiots that were part of the BLM movement that were yelling at Rand Paul. I saw a portion of the video that shows a police officer being shoved. Luckily, nobody was seriously hurt, far I understand, even though Rand Paul said that he was attacked, and he made it like he was physically attacked, like it was one of his neighbors, for lack of a better term or joke. But with that being said, can you tell us what exactly you saw there, and is my description of what took place fairly accurate?
Somewhat. So I would say, he came out. He had a police detail, and there was like local Washington, D.C. police, like the Metropolitan Police Department, and they were out with him. To be honest, I'm not sure why he was walking from the White House over to his hotel as opposed to taking some kind of transportation, but that's whatever's going on internally there. So when I came up on the scene, he was already surrounded by, first off, the police. That's like a small circle around him, and then a wider circle around that of the crowd of the Black Lives Matter protesters. The vast majority of them, their main thing was chanting Breonna Taylor. They, were trying to, because he is the Kentucky senator, so the Breonna Taylor case that happened there, that was a big priority for them to kind of confront him on that issue. And for the most part, I'll be honest, he looked scared. He really did look scared, and I don't say that to try to put a man down or anything, but just looking in his eyes, and then seeing the crowd around him, I definitely think there was some fear there. Now, things weren't violent, and I'm going to be honest. I've seen so many of these protests where people start throwing water bottles and then projectiles and sometimes even fireworks, and there was none of that with this. So they did at least, it was a lot of yelling, a lot of crowding around. The closest they got, once they started to move Rand Paul along and try to get him closer to his hotel, those crowds, they stayed closed in, and the police were outnumbered there. There were definitely more Black Lives Matter protesters that were surrounding that group than there were police officers present at that scene. So the police knew they weren't going to be, actively trying to push the crowd away. It was one of those things where it's just surround Rand Paul and try to get him to his hotel and then, figure things out after that. And so as they tried to move him along, somebody did, I think one of the officers had said, back up to one of the protesters, and then the protester said in response, you back up, pushed into the bicycle, which then caused that officer to stumble back, which then stumbled back into Rand Paul. You can see them kind of stumble in the video that I had shot, and then Rand Paul kind of grabs the officer from behind, almost like to pull him closer to him as protection. And they just kind of move forward. So, in terms of anything physical on Rand Paul himself, I did not witness anything like that. I do know that because of the little pushing and shoving that was going on there, they did stumble, and that was definitely a tense moment because in that moment I did wonder if the crowd would decide enough's enough, we're closing in, and we're just going to swarm these officers. I wasn't
so to me,
sure
Brendan, and to me, Brendan, that would have been absolutely an attack, and I'm so glad that did not happen. Even though I can't stand Rand Paul, and I understand why people don't like him, I don't condone yelling at people and that sort of behavior. But with that being said, would you label it the way Rand Paul is labeling it, as he was attacked? Because I don't see it that way.
Yeah, I did see that in heated morning interviews the morning after, saying he was attacked by a mob. I think that was the quote. Yeah. I wouldn't describe it that way. I would say he was surrounded by angry protesters.
Absolutely.
That's absolutely accurate.
Absolutely.
But attacked, because I've seen officers and political officials actually attacked at these things, and that wasn't the equivalent. If people wanted to attack, they probably would have, from further back in the group, been throwing projectiles, water bottles, things like that. They've been doing at so many of these protests already, and none of that was happening.
Yeah, I mean, like Rand Paul's neighbor attacked him. Okay, we can all agree on that. That was an attack.
That was a real attack.
So when you say
that being said, the fact that those protesters or the mob, I guess, was yelling at Breonna Taylor's name to Rand Paul, who actually wrote the bill, the senator in Kentucky who actually wrote the bill, eliminated the no-knock warrant, to me shows how ignorant they are.
Rand Paul's... okay, go ahead, Brandon.
The issue that a lot of the protests, it's interesting you bring that up. A lot of the protesters recognized that and said the issue is that it wasn't a no-knock call that resulted in the Breonna Taylor case, that the officers had actually knocked in that case. So the bill was, in her name, but it wasn't actually relevant to her specific case.
Right.
And it applies to federal, not to state and local.
That's a good point. That's exactly what I was just going to say.